The Adventure of the Vanishing Diplomat, featuring Detective Jane Parsons. Thank you for listening to our full-length audiobook channel. Please like, share, and subscribe. It is appreciated. Chapter 1. The Disappearance of Mr. Harold Whitmore. It was a cold, rain-swept morning in London when Detective Jane Parsons received the urgent telegram. She was in the middle of breakfast, toast and black tea, when the doorbell rang. Her landlady, Mrs. Beecham, bustled into the sitting room, a telegram in her flour-dusted hands. "A message for you, Miss Parsons," she said, frowning. "Looks important. Came straight from Scotland Yard." Jane took the envelope and tore it open with a swift motion. Urgent. Head of Labour Party, Harold Whitmore, missing, last seen. Last night, after political meeting, London. Police request your assistance immediately. Please report to Inspector Frankland at Whitmore Residence, Mayfair. Jane exhaled slowly, folding the telegram. Missing? Harold Whitmore was not just an ordinary politician. He was the leader of the Labour Party, a man with sharp intellect and even sharper ambitions. His latest proposals had sparked controversy across the political landscape. And now, mere weeks before Parliament was set to debate his reforms, he had disappeared without a trace. The timing was too convenient to be a coincidence. Within the hour, Jane was en route to Mayfair, her mind already sorting through possibilities. Kidnapping, assassination, a voluntary disappearance. She had seen all three in her years as an investigator, but the involvement of Scotland Yard hinted at something more. By the time her cab reached the grand, ivy-clad townhouse of Harold Whitmore, a small crowd had gathered outside. Reporters milled about, calling out questions to the constables stationed at the entrance. Their breath misted in the crisp morning air as they jotted down their notes. "Is it true he was taken from his own house?" one shouted. "Was he threatened before he vanished?" asked another. The constables ignored them, forming an impassable barrier at the door. Jane, however, flashed the telegram and was swiftly admitted. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The grand hall was dimly lit, despite the daylight filtering through the high windows. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance, its sound loud in the silence. She was met by Inspector Edward Frankland, a gruff but intelligent officer she had crossed paths with before. He was standing near the staircase, speaking in low tones to a woman in a velvet dressing gown. "Ah, Miss Parsons," Frankland greeted her, stepping forward. "Glad you could come. We have a most troubling situation on our hands." "I gathered as much," Jane replied. She glanced toward the woman, who dabbed at her reddened eyes with a lace handkerchief. Eleanor Whitmore, Harold's wife. Her pale complexion and trembling hands suggested a sleepless night. "Mrs. Whitmore, my sincerest sympathies," Jane said gently. "Can you tell me what happened?" Eleanor inhaled shakily. "Harold, he never came home last night. He left for his meeting at the Reform Club just after 7, said he wouldn't be too late. But by midnight, when he hadn't returned, I grew anxious. I sent a footman to check, but the club was closed, and no one had seen him since." "Did he often stay out late without informing you?" "Never," Eleanor said firmly. "He was a man of habit. Even during the most chaotic times he would send a message if he were delayed." Jane turned to Frankland. "What do we know so far?" The inspector crossed his arms. "Not much. We confirmed he attended the meeting at the Reform Club. It ended at approximately 10:30. He was seen leaving alone, declining offers to share a cab with his colleagues. He said he had a personal errand to run. That was the last sighting." Jane frowned. "Any indication of threats? Enemies?" Franklin gave a humourless chuckle. "He was a politician, Miss Parsons. That's an occupation built on enemies. But no specific threats have come to light. Yet." Jane turned back to Eleanor. "Did Mr. Whitmore seem unsettled before his disappearance? any unusual behaviour? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he was preoccupied lately. Restless. He had these confidential documents with him, political proposals, part of his new reform agenda. He was carrying them last night in his briefcase. If something happened to him, those documents are missing too. A flicker of interest sparked in Jane's mind. A missing politician was one thing, but a missing politician carrying valuable political plans, that could mean something far more sinister. "Did anyone else know about these documents?" she pressed. Eleanor swallowed hard. Only a few members of his inner circle. His secretary, Miss Beatrice Linton, helped draft them. His political rival, Sir Reginald Barrington, was aware of them, but opposed their content fiercely, and his old friend James Holloway knew Harold was carrying them last night. Jane took mental notes. A secretary, a rival, and a trusted friend, all with knowledge of the very papers Whitmore had with him when he vanished. "Inspector," Jane said, "I'd like to see Mr. Whitmore's study. There might be something there that gives us an idea of his state of mind before he left." Franklin nodded. "Follow me." They ascended the grand staircase and entered a dark-panelled room filled with books and scattered documents. A desk sat in the centre, its surface neat except for a locked drawer. Eleanor lingered in the doorway. "I tried opening it last night, but I couldn't," she admitted. "Harold kept a key on his watch chain, but it's missing." Franklin pulled a set of tools from his coat and broke the lock. The drawer slid open with a soft creak. Inside lay a stack of letters, many bearing foreign stamps, and a single torn scrap of paper with hastily scrawled words. "I fear I am followed. If something happens to me." And that was all. The rest had been ripped away. It was clear that Whitmore had known he was in danger. But why hadn't he sought help? And where had he gone that night, alone and carrying documents that others might kill for? One thing was certain. This was no simple disappearance. Chapter 2. The secrets he carried. Jane looked at the torn piece of paper again, studying it again. Had Whitmore been disturbed while penning it? Had he ripped the paper himself, fearful of committing more to writing? Or had someone else found it before her, ensuring that the most critical part of his message never saw the light of day? Eleanor Whitmore was still standing near the door. Her pale complexion made her eyes seem even darker, hollowed by worry and sleeplessness. Jane turned to her. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you recognize this handwriting?" Eleanor barely glanced at the note before nodding. "Yes, that is Harold's. There's no doubt." Jane traced the torn edge with her thumb. "It suggests he was afraid of something, or someone. Had he mentioned any concerns in the days leading up to his disappearance?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "He was restless. At first I thought it was simply the usual stress of politics, but lately he had been sleeping poorly, waking in the middle of the night to pace the study. I once caught him peering out the window, as if searching for something, or someone." "Did he say what worried him?" "No." She swallowed. "But I know it had to do with the new policies he was preparing. He carried the documents everywhere, never letting them out of his sight. He even refused to let Beatrice, his secretary, take them home for safekeeping, as she usually did. He said—" She trailed off. Jane tilted her head. "Yes?" Eleanor's hands tightened around the fabric of her gown. "He said they were too dangerous to leave anywhere unattended. I don't know what he meant by that. I asked, but he wouldn't tell me." Jane exchanged a glance with Inspector Frankland, who had been listening with arms folded. He gave a slow nod, indicating he too found this detail noteworthy. If these papers were dangerous, Jane mused, then they were valuable to someone. And if he vanished while carrying them, then we must consider that his disappearance might not have been personal. It may have been political. Franklin grunted. Possible, but we have no proof of that yet. The real question is, did he disappear willingly, fearing for his life, or was he taken by force? Jane tapped the drawer. I'd wager against a voluntary disappearance. If Whitmore planned to flee, he wouldn't have left behind this half-written warning. If anything, it suggests he didn't have time to finish. Eleanor clutched at her pearl necklace. Oh, God! You think someone came for him? Jane gave her a measured look. I think it's a strong possibility. She turned back to the desk and examined the contents of the drawer more thoroughly. There was a small bundle of letters, bound together with a thin ribbon. She picked one up. The paper was thick, expensive. Foreign stamps marked the corners. These letters, she murmured, flipping one over. Who are they from? Eleanor frowned. I don't know. Harold never discussed his correspondence with me. Jane opened one of the letters, carefully unfolding the crisp sheet within. The message was written in French, in elegant but forceful script. Though her grasp of the language was serviceable, she needed no translation for the salutation. Mon cher ami. My dear friend, Jane read aloud, do you know of any acquaintances your husband had in France? She asked, looking at Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor's brow creased. No, none that I can recall. Franklin took the letter from Jane's hands and scanned it. It mentions a meeting, Wednesday, after nightfall. No others must know. He raised a brow. This was dated 2 weeks ago. Jane narrowed her eyes. And do we know where Whitmore was that night? Eleanor frowned, thinking back. I believe he had an engagement in Parliament. He returned home very late, but he told me nothing unusual had occurred. Did he return alone? Yes, I remember because I had waited up for him, worried. He seemed exhausted but preoccupied. He barely spoke before retiring to bed. Jane turned back to the letters. The French connection intrigued her. France and England had an uneasy relationship in political matters, and if Whitmore had been in contact with someone across the Channel, it could mean a diplomatic element to his disappearance. She sifted through the remaining letters. Most were signed with initials only, a D. Whoever this A.D. was, they had been corresponding with Whitmore for some time. Inspector, Jane said, we need to find out who A.D. is. If Whitmore was meeting with foreign contacts, this could be bigger than a simple missing persons case. Franklin nodded. I'll have my men check the Foreign Office for any connections between Whitmore and a French diplomat with those initials. Jane turned back to Eleanor. One last question. The documents your husband carried, do you know exactly what they contained? Eleanor hesitated. Only that they involved labour reforms and certain international agreements. I believe Harold was drafting a proposal that would change trade relations significantly. It was controversial. Some said it would weaken British industry, but Harold was convinced it would prevent future economic instability. Jane absorbed this information, a political reform proposal that threatened powerful interests, a secret foreign contact, a missing man carrying important documents. Too many pieces of the puzzle were already pointing in a dangerous direction. She straightened. Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you remain at home for the time being. Someone may return here looking for more information. Eleanor nodded weakly, still clutching her pearls. Franklin glanced at Jane. What's our next move? Jane tapped the bundle of letters. We need to find Beatrice Linton. As Whitmore's secretary, she would know more about these papers than anyone else. If he confided in anyone, it would be her. Franklin grunted in agreement. She lives near the embankment. I'll have my men bring her in. Jane shook her head. Number. Let's go to her directly. If she knows something, we'll get more out of her in her own surroundings. The inspector considered this, then nodded. "Very well, let's go." As they left the study, Jane cast one final glance at the torn note on the desk. "I fear I am followed. If something happens to me." Harold Whitmore had been afraid, and if his fears had proven correct, then somewhere in the city the man who had followed him was still watching and waiting. Chapter 3. The Four Suspects. The streets of London were damp and shrouded in mist as Jane Parsons and Inspector Frankland made their way toward the embankment. The fog curled along the gaslit avenues, blurring the sharp edges of buildings. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones filled the silence as Jane pondered the mystery at hand. As the carriage jolted over a rut in the road, Jane glanced at Frankland. "Beatrice Linton! What do we know of her?" The inspector adjusted his coat and frowned. "A capable woman by all accounts, Whitmore's secretary for the past 3 years, devoted to her work, meticulous with details, and fiercely loyal. But," he gave Jane a meaningful look, "loyalty can be a dangerous thing. If she knew too much about his plans, she may have become a target herself." Jane nodded thoughtfully. "Or an accomplice." Franklin grunted. "That too." The carriage slowed as they arrived at a modest townhouse near the river. Beatrice Linton's residence was tidy but unremarkable, the kind of dwelling occupied by respectable professionals who preferred quiet efficiency over extravagance. A single lantern burned at the door, casting flickering shadows onto the fog-draped steps. Franklin knocked firmly, and after a moment the door creaked open to reveal a woman in her late 30s, her hair pinned neatly beneath a hat. Her sharp features softened with surprise at the sight of them. "Miss Linton?" Jane inquired. "Yes," the woman replied, voice measured but wary. "I am Private Investigator Jane Parsons, and this is Inspector Frankland of Scotland Yard. We need to speak with you regarding Mr. Whitmore." Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. Has something happened?" Franklin's expression was grim. "Mr. Whitmore has disappeared." A sharp inhale. "Disappeared? That's impossible. I spoke to him yesterday afternoon. He was, well, if a little preoccupied. She broke off, eyes darkening with realization. "He had the documents with him, didn't he?" Jane studied her closely. "Yes, and now both he and the documents are missing." Beatrice swayed slightly, as if the news had knocked the breath from her. Then, as quickly as the emotion surfaced, she masked it with professional calm. "Please, come in." They stepped inside the small but tidy sitting room. Papers and books were arranged in careful stacks, a small writing desk positioned near the window. Frankland wasted no time. "Miss Linton, when was the last time you saw Whitmore?" "Yesterday afternoon, at his office." Beatrice perched on the edge of a chair, hands clasped. "We went over his speech for the upcoming session. He was distracted, though, as if his mind was elsewhere." "Did he say anything unusual?" Jane prompted. Beatrice hesitated. "Not exactly, but he did ask me if I had ever felt like I was being watched." Jane exchanged a glance with Frankland. That aligned with Eleanor Whitmore's account. "What did you tell him?" "I thought he was speaking metaphorically, about political scrutiny, perhaps. But now—" She trailed off, worry creasing her brow. Jane leaned forward. "Miss Linton, do you know what was in the documents he carried?" Beatrice bit her lip. "Yes, they outlined a new proposal that would alter labour laws, particularly concerning factory conditions and trade unions. He believed it would be revolutionary, but not everyone agreed. Some feared it would weaken industry. Others—" She hesitated. "Others thought it would expose corruption." "Corruption?" Frankland repeated sharply. Beatrice nodded. "Yes, Certain powerful figures, businessmen, politicians, would have much to lose if Whitmore's proposals became public. Miss Linton, do you believe someone might have wanted to stop him? Jane asked. A pause. Then reluctantly, Beatrice whispered, Yes. Jane folded her arms. Who? The secretary hesitated, then exhaled. I can think of 4 people who had reason to oppose him. She pulled out a small notebook and began listing names. 1. Sir Reginald Barrington, a Conservative politician known for his opposition to Whitmore's policies. A man of immense wealth and influence, he viewed Whitmore's labour reforms as a threat to the economy. 2. James Holloway, a wealthy industrialist with ties to Parliament. His factories would have been directly affected by the new policies. Rumours suggested he had influence over certain officials, and some whispered of bribery. 3. Beatrice Linton. Myself, she admitted, though her voice was firm. I did not oppose Harold, but I was privy to all his plans. If someone wanted to control or silence him, they might believe I was involved. 4. Inspector Maurice Dunhill, a Scotland Yard official who had been investigating business-related corruption. A staunch opponent of the Labour Party, he had once publicly dismissed Whitmore as a reckless idealist. Jane considered the list. 4 names. 4 possible motives. But which, if any, was connected to Whitmore's disappearance? Miss Linton, Jane said, do you trust all of these individuals? Beatrice hesitated. I don't know, but I can tell you one thing. Sir Reginald Barrington openly threatened Whitmore in the past. Jane's gaze sharpened. Threatened how? There was an argument some months ago, Beatrice recalled. Whitmore accused Barrington of conspiring with business leaders to block his reforms. Barrington called him a fool and said he would end his career one way or another. Jane absorbed this. And James Holloway? He was more discreet, but I know he sent letters to Whitmore, letters urging him to reconsider his policies. When Harold ignored them, Holloway stopped speaking to him entirely. Frankland let out a low whistle. That's a lot of powerful enemies. Jane stood. Then we begin with Barrington. She turned to Frankland. If Whitmore's disappearance is tied to his policies, we need to follow the political trail. We must speak with Barrington before word spreads. Frankland nodded. Agreed. I'll have my men watch Holloway and Dunhill. Jane turned to Beatrice. One last question. Did Whitmore say where he was going after the meeting? Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. He mentioned an errand. Jane frowned. Did he say what it was? Beatrice's face went pale. No, she whispered, but I remember something now. As he left, he muttered, If I don't return, you'll know why. A cold silence filled the room. Jane's pulse quickened. Harold Whitmore had known he was walking into danger, and if they didn't find him soon, he might never return at all. Chapter 4. The Last Journey. The evening fog clung to the streets of Westminster like a thick blanket as Jane Parsons and Inspector Frankland arrived at the Reform Club, the last known location of Harold Whitmore before his disappearance. The grand building loomed ahead, its classical columns partially obscured by the mist, its brass lanterns casting a dim glow upon the damp pavement. A doorman in a crisp uniform greeted them, eyeing them with mild curiosity. "Good evening, sir, madam. How may I assist you?" Franklin stepped forward, flashing his badge. "Scotland Yard. We're here regarding Harold Whitmore. He was last seen leaving this club last night. We need to speak to anyone who might have seen him." The doorman stiffened slightly, but nodded. "Of course, sir. Mr. Whitmore arrived yesterday evening at precisely 7 o'clock for a private gathering in one of the club's drawing rooms. He left shortly after 10:30. Jane glanced at Frankland. "Do you recall if he seemed anxious or troubled?" The doorman hesitated, then nodded. "I do. Mr. Whitmore was usually quite amiable when he left. He would exchange pleasantries, even with us at the door. But last night he was different. He was quiet, preoccupied. He stepped out onto the pavement and stood there for a moment as if considering something. Then, without summoning a carriage, he walked off into the night." Jane's interest was piqued. Did he appear to be waiting for someone?
Perhaps. He glanced around before leaving, as though searching for something or someone.
Franklin frowned. "And you're certain he left alone?" The doorman hesitated again. "Not quite, sir. He left alone, but moments later a shadow emerged from across the street and followed after him." "Did you see this person's face?" Jane asked. "No, madam, only a tall figure in a dark coat. Could have been a man, but I can't say for sure." "Did you see where they went?" "They walked together towards St. James's Park, and after that I lost sight of them." Jane and Franklin exchanged a glance. Whitmore had been followed, and given that he never returned home, it was likely that his fate had been sealed not long after he disappeared into the night. Franklin straightened. "We'll need to see the guest book for the private gathering last night." "Of course, sir. Please, follow me." The club's interior was a grand display of wealth and history. High ceilings adorned with intricate moulding, dark mahogany furniture, and the soft hum of well-dressed gentlemen engaged in low conversation. The scent of tobacco and old paper filled the air as they followed the doorman through a corridor leading to the members' lounge. A clerk at the reception desk handed over the guest book from the previous night, its leather cover worn from years of use. Jane flipped through the pages until she found the entry for the meeting. 11 names were listed, including some familiar ones: Harold Whitmore, Sir Reginald Barrington, James Holloway, Beatrice Linton, Maurice Dunhill, Lord Christopher Henshaw, Charles Vane, Edgar Troughton, Francis Willoughby, Dr. Albert Groves, Nicholas Stern. The first 5 names were already of interest. Barrington, Holloway, Linton and Dunhill were all on the suspect list. The remaining attendees were lesser-known figures in political and business circles, but that did not rule them out as having played a role in Whitmore's disappearance. Franklin scanned the list. Barrington and Holloway together at a private political discussion with Whitmore. That's a volatile combination. Jane agreed. "Did Whitmore argue with anyone last night?" she asked the clerk. The man, an older gentleman with thin spectacles perched on the edge of his nose, thought for a moment before replying. "The discussion was spirited, shall we say. Mr. Whitmore and Sir Reginald Barrington were at odds over the proposed Labour reforms. At one point, voices were raised. Mr. Whitmore accused Barrington of having hidden hands in every corrupt corner of industry. Sir Reginald was not pleased by the remark." "Did the argument escalate?" Franklin asked. "No, but there was definite tension when they left." Jane tapped the guest book. "Who was the last person to leave after Whitmore?" The clerk turned a few pages in his notes. "That would be James Holloway. He left about 5 minutes after Mr. Whitmore." Jane's eyes narrowed. "And did he leave alone?" "I believe so, but I cannot say for certain." If Holloway had left right after Whitmore, was it a coincidence, or had he followed him? "Was there any discussion about where Whitmore planned to go after the meeting?" Jane pressed. The clerk shook his head. "Not that I heard, but he was speaking privately with Beatrice Linton before he left." Jane filed that information away. Beatrice had not mentioned any private conversation after the meeting. Was she withholding information? She closed the guest book and turned to Franklin. "I think it's time we speak with Barrington and Holloway." They exited the club and stepped into the cool night air. Whitmore had known he was being followed. He had left the meeting unsettled. his mind burdened by whatever secrets he carried. And someone, either Holloway, a hired agent, or another unseen enemy, had made sure he never reached home. They were about to call for a carriage when a beggar shuffled toward them, an old tattered cap pulled low over his face.
"Spare a coin for a poor man, miss," he croaked.
Franklin instinctively reached into his pocket, but Jane stilled him. She had caught something in the beggar's expression, a flicker of recognition. "Have we met before?" she asked sharply. The beggar hesitated, then leaned in and whispered, "I saw him, miss. I saw the man you're looking for." Franklin stiffened. "What do you mean?" The beggar glanced around nervously. "The man? Whitmore, I saw him near the park last night, not long after he left that fancy club. There was another fellow with him, whispering something urgent." Jane's pulse quickened. "Did you see the other man's face?" "No, miss, but I saw his hand. He had a gold ring with a strange crest on it." Jane and Franklin exchanged a glance. That was a detail worth noting. "Anything else?" The beggar hesitated, then muttered, "They walked toward a carriage waiting near the river. That's the last I saw." Jane fished out a few coins and placed them in the beggar's palm. "Thank you." As the man shuffled away, Franklin exhaled. "A gold ring with a crest. That narrows things down." Jane nodded. "We need to find out who wears such a ring, but more importantly, we need to find out whose carriage was waiting by the river that night. Because if they could trace the carriage, they might just find Harold Whitmore, alive or dead." Chapter 5. A Letter from the Dead. The morning fog had begun to dissipate as Jane Parsons and Inspector Franklin stood near the edge of the Thames, where the beggar had last seen Harold Whitmore. The river, dark and sluggish, carried with it the scent of damp wood and the faint brine of the sea. Franklin motioned for one of his men, who was already questioning a dock worker nearby. The constable returned after a moment, shaking his head.
"No witnesses have come forward about a carriage last night," the constable reported. "Could be it came and went without stopping long enough for anyone to notice."
Jane sighed. Or the driver was clever enough to ensure he wasn't seen. Franklin crossed his arms. "We need more than just a beggar's word. A carriage by the river suggests Whitmore was taken somewhere discreet, perhaps onto a boat. If so, he might already be out of London, or worse." Jane agreed, but something still felt incomplete. The presence of a gold ring with a crest was significant. Rings of that nature were typically worn by aristocrats, high-ranking officials, or members of exclusive societies. If she could find out who owned such a ring, she might be able to trace the person who had last seen Whitmore alive. As they turned away from the river, a young boy in a messenger's cap rushed toward them, waving an envelope. "Miss Parsons, a letter for you!" Jane took the envelope, her fingers tightening slightly as she noticed there was no sender's name. "Who gave this to you?" she asked. The boy shrugged. "A gentleman. Didn't give his name, just said it was for you. Paid me well to bring it straight away." Jane exchanged a glance with Franklin before breaking the seal and unfolding the paper inside. The message was typed, an unusual choice. "Miss Parsons, you are searching for a man who may already be beyond your reach. If you truly wish to find him, go to Holloway's foundry at sundown. Come alone. Do not involve the police. If you do, Whitmore will never be found." Franklin swore under his breath. "A threat or a warning?" Jane reread the note carefully. "Holloway's foundry." She turned to Franklin. "That's James Holloway's industrial operation, isn't it?" Franklin nodded grimly. "Yes, a large ironworks facility south of the city. Holloway is one of the wealthiest industrialists in England, with plenty of workers under his payroll. If he's involved in Whitmore's disappearance,
We might be walking into a trap. Jane folded the letter, tucking it inside her coat. It's a risk I have to take. Franklin frowned. You're not seriously considering going alone? I don't intend to, Jane said, but whoever sent this believes I will. That means we have an opportunity to turn the tables. Franklin's expression darkened. Then we'll have men stationed nearby. The moment things look dangerous, we move in. Jane nodded, but an uneasy feeling crept over her. If someone had gone through the trouble of sending this letter, they were either leading her to the truth or straight into the lion's den. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jane arrived at Holloway's foundry, a towering industrial complex surrounded by high brick walls. The ironworks was largely silent at this hour, save for the occasional clang of metal and the distant hiss of steam. Smoke curled from a few remaining chimneys. She approached cautiously, stepping through the large wrought-iron gates that were slightly ajar. Inside, the factory was vast, lined with rows of heavy machinery. The air smelled of oil and soot. A single lantern flickered near the far end of the foundry floor. A figure stood beside it, partially obscured by shadows. Jane took careful steps forward. I received your letter. The figure shifted, stepping into the light. It was Beatrice Linton. Jane stopped short. Miss Linton? The secretary's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Parsons, I had to meet you here. Jane narrowed her eyes. You sent the letter? Beatrice shook her head. Number someone slipped it under my door this morning. But I came because She paused, swallowing hard. I think I know what happened to Mr. Whitmore. Jane's breath caught. Where is he? Beatrice hesitated, glancing around nervously. He's alive, I think. Jane took a slow step forward. Miss Linton, you need to tell me everything you know. Who took him? Before Beatrice could answer, a sharp sound echoed through the factory, a heavy door slamming shut. Jane spun around, her senses on high alert. The gates were closing. A low, deliberate voice cut through the air. You should not have come here, Miss Parsons. Out of the darkness emerged two men, their faces partially obscured by the dim light. One of them, the taller of the two, lifted a lantern, revealing the gleam of a gold ring on his hand. The same ring the beggar had described. Where is Whitmore? Jane demanded. The man smirked. Closer than you think. Before Jane could react, a deafening sound cracked through the air. A gunshot. Beatrice cried out and collapsed to the ground. Jane immediately ducked behind a stack of iron bars, her mind racing. The trap had been sprung. Footsteps pounded toward her. They were coming for her next. Jane drew the small pistol she had decided to carry in her coat. Franklin, better not be far behind, she muttered under her breath. Another shot rang out, striking a pipe near her head. She had seconds to act. She turned, aimed, and fired. The bullet struck one of the men in the leg, and he crumpled with a yell. But the other man was moving fast, closing the distance. Jane had no choice. She bolted toward Beatrice, who was gasping in pain, clutching her shoulder. Hold on, Jane whispered, dragging the woman toward cover. But before she could get her bearings, strong hands seized her from behind. A rough cloth covered her mouth. The scent of chloroform filled her nose. Her vision blurred. Darkness closed in. The last thing she heard was the voice of the man with the gold ring, murmuring, Miss Parsons, you are in way over your head. And then, nothing. Chapter 6. A Deal with the Enemy. Jane Parsons awoke to the dull pounding of her head and the acrid scent of damp stone. A cold chill ran through her as she opened her eyes, her vision adjusting slowly to the dim, flickering light of an oil lamp set on a rickety wooden table nearby. She was in a basement or a cellar, the rough stone walls slick with moisture. A single heavy iron door stood at the far end of the room. And she was not alone. Across from her, Beatrice Linton was slumped against the wall, her face pale from blood loss. Her shoulder was wrapped in a crude bandage, likely meant to stop the bleeding from the gunshot wound she had sustained at Holloway's foundry. Jane's hands instinctively moved, but they didn't get far. Her wrists were bound. Thick rope cut into her skin as she flexed her fingers, testing the knot. A deep voice pulled her attention back to the present. "Miss Parsons," the man with the gold ring said, stepping into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a finely tailored coat, one that suggested wealth and influence. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, but it was his eyes that unsettled her. Cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Jane studied him carefully. "You went to a great deal of trouble to bring me here. I assume you have something to say." The man smirked. "I do, but first let's dispense with formalities." He took a step closer. "Do you know who I am?" Jane tilted her head. "I have my suspicions." The gold ring was the key. She had seen it before, worn by high-ranking members of the Imperial Order, a secretive organization of aristocrats and industrialists known for operating behind the scenes of British politics. She narrowed her eyes. "You are Lord Christopher Henshaw." The man gave a slow, approving nod. "Very good, Miss Parsons, and since you are so astute, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending that you have any control over the situation." Jane remained calm. "Where is Harold Whitmore?" Henshaw chuckled. "Straight to the point, I like that." He motioned behind him, and a second man entered the room. It was James Holloway. The wealthy industrialist adjusted his gloves, his gaze shifting between Jane and Beatrice. "I told you she wouldn't go down without a fight," he said to Henshaw. "She's predictable," Henshaw replied smoothly, "and that makes her easy to control." Jane's lips curled into a smirk. "If you think I'm predictable, you don't know me at all." Henshaw only smiled. "We shall see." Beatrice let out a pained groan, drawing Jane's attention. The secretary's eyes fluttered open. "Where?" she murmured weakly. Jane leaned toward her, despite the bindings on her wrists. "Stay with me, Miss Linton. We're going to get out of this." Henshaw chuckled. Brave words, but misplaced optimism. He took a chair and sat across from Jane, his demeanour one of complete confidence. "You wish to know where Whitmore is?" he said casually. "That depends entirely on you." Jane's fingers curled into fists. "You kidnapped him!" Holloway scoffed. "We rescued him from himself." Jane's eyes flashed. "What does that mean?" Henshaw sighed as if explaining something to a slow student. "Mr. Whitmore was about to make a grave mistake. His new policies would have destroyed the economy, thrown thousands of workers into unemployment, and weakened Britain's standing on the world stage." Jane's jaw tightened. "Or it would have exposed corruption that benefited you and your allies." Holloway's expression darkened. "He was interfering in matters he didn't understand. He thought he was helping the common man. In reality, he was destabilizing the very institutions that keep Britain running." Jane gave him a cold smile. "And let me guess, you and Henshaw, along with a few other powerful friends, decided it was better if Whitmore simply disappeared?" Henshaw leaned forward. "We had hoped to reason with him." Jane scoffed. "You kidnapped him? That's hardly a negotiation tactic." Henshaw shrugged. "We needed time to persuade him. He is currently safe, but that could change." A dangerous silence filled the room. Jane inhaled slowly. "What do you want from me?" Henshaw smiled again, the expression almost fatherly. "You're an intelligent woman, Miss Parsons, and a rational one. I believe you understand that some fights cannot be won." Jane said nothing, but she held his gaze. I propose a deal, Henshaw continued. You will walk away from this case. You will tell Scotland Yard that Whitmore left of his own accord, that he has chosen a quiet retirement, far from the burdens of political life. Jane's pulse quickened. And if I refuse? Henshaw's smile disappeared. Then Whitmore will be found floating in the Thames, and you and Miss Linton will suffer an unfortunate accident. Beatrice let out a weak whimper. Jane clenched her teeth. She needed time to figure out where Whitmore was being held, time to escape. She exhaled and nodded slowly. I'll need proof that Whitmore is alive before I consider anything. Henshaw's smirk returned. A fair request. He motioned to Holloway, who reached into his coat and pulled out a folded note. He tossed it onto the floor near Jane's feet. Jane glanced at it, then back at Henshaw. Untie me. Henshaw gestured, and one of his men cut the ropes binding her hands. Jane rubbed her wrists and reached for the note. The handwriting was undeniably Whitmore's. Jane, if you are reading this, I am alive, but not free. Do not trust them. They want me to sign something. I am at ... The rest of the note was torn off. Jane's heart pounded. He was being forced to sign something, likely a letter of resignation or a public statement supporting Henshaw's policies. She folded the note carefully and looked up. If I agree to your terms, what guarantees do I have that Whitmore will be released unharmed? Henshaw smiled. That will depend on you. Prove to us that you are willing to be reasonable, and we will do the same. Jane forced herself to nod. I need time to think. Henshaw rose to his feet. You have 24 hours. He gestured to one of his men. Take her back to the city, blindfold her. Jane's heart was beating fast, but she remained outwardly calm. 24 hours, that was all she had. As the cloth was tied over her eyes, she focused on what she had learned. Whitmore was alive. He was being forced to sign something, and somewhere, in the shadows of London, a dangerous conspiracy was unfolding. She would play along, for now. But she had no intention of walking away. She would find Harold Whitmore, and she would bring down everyone involved. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Shadows. The blindfold was rough against Jane Parsons' face as she was led up a flight of stairs, her arms held firmly by unseen hands. The musty scent of damp stone and the distant hum of city life told her they were back above ground. The moment she felt a rush of cold night air, she realized she was being taken outside. A sharp voice spoke near her ear. You will be released, Miss Parsons, but remember, 24 hours. Do not waste them. Then, without warning, the grip on her arms vanished. A hard shove sent her stumbling forward. Her boots skidded against loose gravel before she caught herself, yanking off the blindfold just in time to see a carriage speeding away into the fog. Jane stood still, drawing in a slow breath to steady herself. She was alone. Glancing around, she recognised where they had left her, the East End of London, near the Docklands. It was an area filled with twisting alleyways, abandoned warehouses, and the occasional dock worker moving crates under the pale light of gas lamps. If they had released her here, they had assumed she would be disoriented. They were wrong. Jane had spent years navigating London's streets. She knew exactly where she was, and more importantly, she knew where she needed to go. Henshaw and Holloway had given her 24 hours to walk away. She would use that time to find Harold Whitmore. After slipping away from the docks, she made her way to the Scotland Yard, where she found Inspector Frankland waiting in his office. His face was tense, and the moment he saw her, he let out a curse. "Damn it, Parsons! We thought they'd killed you!" Jane dropped into the chair across from him. "Not yet, but we have no time to waste. They've given me 24 hours to abandon the case." Frankland scowled. "And I assume you don't intend to?" Jane's smirk was humourless. "Not even remotely." She placed Whitmore's note on the inspector's desk. He's alive. They're forcing him to sign something, likely a resignation letter or a statement supporting Henshaw's agenda. Franklin read the note, his expression darkening. If he's still alive, that means we have a chance to get to him. Jane nodded. But we have to be smart. Henshaw and Holloway control too many people. We can't risk a full police raid. Someone will tip them off before we get there. Franklin rubbed his chin. So, what do you suggest? Jane leaned forward. First, we find out where he's being held, and I know exactly where to start. Eleanor Whitmore's townhouse in Mayfair was silent when Jane arrived. The house had the air of a mausoleum, curtains drawn, dimly lit corridors, and a household frozen in uncertainty. A maid answered the door. Mrs. Whitmore isn't seeing visitors. She'll see me, Jane said, stepping past the threshold. The maid hesitated, then relented, leading Jane into the drawing room. A few minutes later, Eleanor Whitmore appeared, dressed in deep mourning black despite her husband not yet being declared dead. Her normally composed face was lined with exhaustion. Miss Parsons, she greeted warily. I assume you bring news. Jane studied her closely. Your husband is alive. Eleanor sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers curled against the dark silk of her dress. Where is he? That's what I intend to find out, Jane said, and I believe you may know more than you realize. Eleanor hesitated. Jane cut her off gently. You loved your husband, Mrs. Whitmore, but did you truly know everything about his political dealings? Did he confide in you? Eleanor's lips parted as if to argue, but then she hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. He was worried, not just about his policies, but about who was watching him. Jane's pulse quickened. Who? Eleanor moved to a small writing desk and opened a drawer. From it she retrieved a letter, one that had been hastily tucked away. This arrived 2 days before Harold vanished, she whispered. I didn't know what to do with it. Jane took the letter and scanned it quickly. Mr. Whitmore. You are in grave danger. The men who shake your hand in Parliament will soon turn against you. If you do not leave your position, they will ensure you are removed permanently. Do not go to Henshaw. Do not go to Holloway. They are not your allies. If you wish to live, disappear before it is too late. A friend? Jane's breath hitched. This was a warning letter. Someone had tried to alert Whitmore before it was too late. Jane met Eleanor's gaze. Do you know who sent this? Eleanor shook her head. No, but he must have trusted them. He kept it in his personal files, hidden but not discarded. Jane folded the letter carefully. This means someone within Henshaw's circle didn't agree with what was happening. That means we may have an inside source. Eleanor's eyes widened. You think someone wants to betray Henshaw? Jane nodded. And we need to find them before Henshaw finds out. Returning to Scotland Yard, Jane met Franklin outside his office, his expression unreadable. You were right, he said, handing her a confidential file. I did some digging on Henshaw's associates. One of them has been under quiet investigation for a while now. Jane opened the file and saw a name that sent a jolt through her. Inspector Maurice Dunhill. She looked up sharply. The same Maurice Dunhill who was at Whitmore's meeting? Franklin nodded grimly. Dunhill works for Scotland Yard, but he's also been deeply involved in Henshaw's dealings. The difference is, he's been feeding information to someone else. Jane's mind raced. Then he's our inside man. Franklin nodded. The question is, can we trust him? Jane exhaled slowly. We have no choice. If he knows where Whitmore is being held, he's our best chance of getting him out alive. Franklin grabbed his coat. Then let's pay Dunhill a visit. Dunhill's residence was a modest, unassuming townhouse near Baker Street. When Jane and Frankland arrived, the door was ajar. Jane's instincts screamed danger. She exchanged a glance with Frankland before pulling out her pistol. They stepped inside carefully. The air smelled of stale whiskey and gunpowder. And then a body slumped over a desk. Maurice Dunhill. A single gunshot wound to the chest. On the desk lay a final, unfinished letter. Jane picked it up, her hands steady even as her heart pounded. "Parsons, you were right. Whitmore is being held at—" The sentence ended abruptly. Blood smeared the lower half of the paper. Franklin swore under his breath. "Someone got to him first!" Jane clenched her jaw. Dunhill had known where Whitmore was, and now the only person who could have led them to him was dead. Chapter 8. The Vanishing Act Unraveled. Inspector Franklin crouched beside the corpse, inspecting the wound. Close-range shot. Someone wanted him dead fast. He exhaled through his nose. They knew he was a weak link. Jane nodded grimly, her fingers tightening around the unfinished letter Dunhill had been writing before his life was cut short. Jane tapped the letter with one finger, thinking, whoever did this didn't have time to destroy the letter entirely. That means they were in a hurry. Franklin stood, which means they may have left in a hurry too. Jane's sharp eyes scanned the desk. Papers were scattered, drawers left half open. The killer had searched for something, perhaps other documents that Dunhill had hidden, but she was more interested in what was missing than what was left behind. Her gaze landed on a small patch of dust where something had once rested. She pointed at it. There was something here, a small box or a case? Frankland followed her gaze. A document case, maybe? Possibly. Jane moved to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines. As her hand brushed one volume, something shifted. A soft click. The bookshelf swung open slightly, a hidden compartment. She and Frankland exchanged a look before she pushed it fully open, revealing a single envelope tucked inside. Jane grabbed it and tore it open. Inside was a hand-drawn map. She spread it out on Dunhill's desk. The sketch depicted an old estate, large, isolated. But Jane's heart skipped when she saw the name scrawled in the corner. Ravenswood Manor. Franklin's brow furrowed. That's Lord Henshaw's old property. He inherited it from his father, but hasn't lived there in years. Jane traced her fingers over the map. If you were hiding a kidnapped political leader, where better than an abandoned manor with no staff? Franklin nodded grimly. It's worth checking out. Jane folded the map. We leave immediately. Ravenswood Manor was a grim, brooding structure perched on the edge of the English countryside like a forgotten relic. It had been abandoned for years, yet tonight light flickered in one of the upper windows. Jane and Franklin crouched behind a tangle of bushes, watching the house from the tree line. There, Jane whispered, pointing. Guards at the front, 2 men. Franklin nodded, which means there's something, or someone, worth protecting inside. They had come prepared. Franklin had quietly arranged for a small group of trusted officers to accompany them, ensuring no one could warn Henshaw in advance. Jane tapped his arm. We need a distraction. Give me 2 minutes, then cause a commotion near the west side. Franklin didn't argue. He disappeared into the shadows while Jane moved silently toward the back entrance. She picked the lock swiftly, slipping inside just as a loud crash echoed from the west. The guards outside shouted in confusion, running toward the noise. Jane didn't hesitate. She crept through the darkened halls, heart pounding. The house smelled of dust and damp wood, but something else lingered, the faint scent of cigar smoke. Someone was definitely here. She moved up the grand staircase, careful to avoid creaky boards. At the end of the corridor, a single door was locked. Jane leaned close, listening. A faint shuffle, a groan. Using a small tool from her coat, she worked the lock open. The door creaked as she pushed it. Inside, Harold Whitmore sat slumped in a chair, wrists bound, face bruised. His once pristine suit was wrinkled and torn, and his eyes flickered open at the sound of movement. "Miss Parsons," he croaked, "you shouldn't be here." Jane hurried forward, untying his wrists. "On the contrary, Mr. Whitmore, I'm exactly where I need to be." Before he could reply, a voice from the doorway froze them both. "Well, well, I should have known you wouldn't let this go." Jane turned slowly to see Lord Christopher Henshaw standing in the doorway, revolver in hand. Behind him, James Holloway stepped forward, arms crossed. Whitmore stiffened in the chair. "So it was you." Henshaw sighed, shaking his head. "Come now, Whitmore, I gave you every chance to cooperate. I was even willing to let you live a quiet life, far away from politics. But you," he sighed, shaking his head, "you had to be stubborn." Jane positioned herself slightly in front of Whitmore. "Killing him won't stop what's coming, Henshaw. People already suspect the truth." Henshaw's lips curled into a smirk. "That's where you're wrong, Miss Parsons. Dead men tell no tales, and neither do inconvenient detectives." "So you were forcing him to sign a resignation letter," she said, "to make it seem like he left on his own accord." Holloway chuckled. "A simple solution. The world would believe Whitmore had stepped down for personal reasons, and Henshaw's reforms would proceed without resistance." Jane arched a brow. "Except he refused." Whitmore's voice was hoarse. "I'd rather die than betray everything I fought for." Henshaw sighed. "An admirable sentiment, but unfortunately—" A gunshot split the air, not from Henshaw, but from the hallway. Henshaw stumbled forward, his hand clutching his arm. Franklin stood behind him, pistol smoking. "Drop the gun, Henshaw!" Franklin growled. The sound of shouting and footsteps filled the manor. The other officers had arrived, surrounding the remaining guards. Holloway paled, realizing their plan had failed. Henshaw, still clutching his wounded arm, let the gun slip from his grip. Jane exhaled. It was over. By dawn, Henshaw and Holloway were in custody. Harold Whitmore was taken to safety, and his political opponent's plot was fully exposed. The public outcry was immediate. News of the conspiracy shook the Parliament, and Henshaw's allies quickly abandoned him, eager to avoid scandal. Sitting in Franklin's office later that morning, Jane allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. "You did good work, Parsons," Franklin admitted gruffly. She smirked. "I always do." Whitmore, now cleaned up and recovering from his ordeal, offered her a grateful nod. "I owe you my life, Miss Parsons." She waved a hand dismissively. "Just another day's work." Franklin chuckled. "And here I thought you were considering retirement." Jane lifted her teacup, smiling slightly. "Not while there are still mysteries to solve."